Joshua 9 verse 1. Now when all the kings west of the Jordan heard about these things, those in the hill country, in the western foothills, and along the entire coast of the Great Sea, as far as Lebanon, the kings of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, they came together to make war against Joshua and Israel. However, when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. The men put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the men of Israel, "We've come from a distant country. Make a treaty with us." The men of Israel said to the Hivites, "But perhaps you live near us. How then can we make a treaty with you?" "We are your servants," they said to Joshua. But Joshua asked, "Who are you and where do you come from?" They answered, "Your servants have come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God, for we have heard reports of him, all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. And our elders and all those living in our country said to us, 'Take provisions for your journey. Go and meet them and say to them, "We are your servants. Make a treaty with us." The bread of ours was warm when we packed it at home on the day we left to come to you, but now see how dry and moldy it is. And these wineskins that we filled were new, but see how cracked they are. And our clothes and sandals are worn out by the very long journey." The men of Israel sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. Then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live, and the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors living near them. So the Israelites set out, and on the third day came to their cities, Gibeon, Kephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them, because the leaders of the assembly had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The whole assembly grumbled against the leaders. But the leaders answered, "We have given them our oath by the Lord, the God of Israel, and we cannot touch them now. This is what we will do to them. We will let them live so that wrath will not fall on us for breaking the oath we swore to them." They continued, "Let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers for the entire community." So the leader's promise to them was kept. Then Joshua summoned the Gibeonites and said, "Why did you deceive us by saying we live a long way from you, while actually you live near us? You are now under a curse. You will never cease to serve as woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God." They answered Joshua, "Your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and to wipe out all its inhabitants from before you. So we feared for our lives because of you, and that is why we did this. We are now in your hands. Do to us whatever seems good and right to you." So Joshua saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. That day he made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the community and for the altar of the Lord at the place the Lord would choose. And that is what they are to this day.
Always consult the Lord is how we've come to the end of our journey through Joshua. We thought we traveled up to, this is chapter 9. I'll touch a little bit on chapter 10 in reference, and we're going to park it for now because we're going to go on to do other things starting next week. This is God's people journeying to enter into the promised land, the land of plenty, the land of rest. The juxtaposition of that as we have COP26 going on and all of that in my head. But this is God's people on a journey trying to get where God promised them years ago that they were going to be. And today we come to this particular story, which, as I said, I've entitled always consult the Lord, because that verse 14, is a crucial verse in chapter 9, which is where Joshua and the men of Israel sampled the provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord, which is interesting. It's a classic of what we do in our modern times. You know, we live in a hostile world, and we sample, us Christians, we sample all sorts of things in this hostile world, and we don't ask of the Lord. And it's surprising, or not, that we actually end up in trouble as often as we do. We don't consult the Lord. So that verse 14 is a very crucial verse in this particular story. But I want to back up a little bit, because I want to suggest to you that all habits, there's a saying that all habits die hard. In other words, they're hard to break. And I've put up a couple of things on the screen for you to see there. They're hard to break. And I wonder if this is what, in part, the Apostle Paul had in mind when he said the following. He said in Romans 7:15, I am a mystery to myself, for I want to do what is right, but end up doing what my moral instincts condemn. Or in other words, I end up doing what I hate. I wonder if this is the kind of thing that the Apostle Paul had in mind when he wrote that. I want to do all the right things, but somehow what I end up doing is not the right things. And yes, when we become Christian, we're a new creation with a new nature. There's no doubt about that. But here is the rub. We do not escape the influence of the old nature. This is why, you know, if you remember, we studied people like Samson with his flaws and all these different characters. And we're very quick, yes, to always point out the nature and the character of God, but also the fact that God deals with flawed humanity. God deals with people like you and me, who are people who make mistakes, people who are not perfect. And God chooses to do that. We all have bad habits. Things that we do even though we know that it can be destructive. You know, we all have bad habits. Certain conditions, some things trigger things in our lives, don't they? And we all have bad habits. There's some of us, for example, let's say there's a lot of stress, a particularly stressful time. For some of us, we hit the bottle, and I mean the alcohol bottle, and we hit it hard. That was one of the things that we noticed during COVID. The alcohol consumption increased incredibly. The shops were telling us how much booze they were selling. But also so did domestic violence and all the knock-on effects of those who probably drank too much, etc. We all have things that trigger this ingrained habit, which like a muscle develops over time. You know, some of us, if we get unhappy, we go for some retail therapy. We go shopping, and we spend money that we haven't got, and then we go home and cry over the debt that we've accumulated. It's classic behavior. Things that trigger off old habits that just won't go away. And we find ourselves doing things that we don't want to do, and then we're full of remorse once again because we've succumbed to the things that we were hoping that we weren't going to give into. I want to suggest to you that Abraham had this problem. Do you remember Abraham and Sarah? Do you remember? Yes, she was his half-sister, but at least twice in Scripture, and Scripture says it negatively, so we know it's a bad habit. When he got into trouble where other kings or other people, other men, saw how beautiful his wife was, and she must have been a cracker because she was an older woman, so she was a real cracker. When they saw that, he would always say, because he was scared of his life, oh, it's my sister. And that was his way of, that was his whole habit. That's how he defended himself. That's when he slipped to. That was his trigger. Men fancy his wife, whoa. Then he says, she's my sister. to save his own skin. I want to suggest to you that it is possible that Joshua had a habit a bit like that, in the sense that his bad habit, I think, was whenever he had a victory, and this is our bad habit too, whenever he had a victory, I think he took his mind off God. Whenever things went well, I think they took their minds off God. And the next thing that came along, he'd forget about consulting God. He certainly did it after Jericho, before he went into Ai, if you remember, although we are also told that it was because of the sin of Achan. But he certainly took his eye off God then. And here we see him doing it again, making the same mistake with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites are an interesting people. I don't know how you feel about them, because they're so shrewd. You kind of like them, don't you? Am I allowed to say that? I like their style. I mean, they've heard about what God is doing. So they say, look, you know something? This God has wiped out, with Joshua, has wiped out Jericho, wiped out Ai. Now, when you read chapter 10, I think it's verse 2, interesting, Jericho was this big place. Ai was this smaller place. The Gibeonites, they were in the middle, so they were bigger than Ai. So they had, and the Bible tells us in chapter 10, I think it's verse 2, that they actually have good fighting soldiers. But they decided, we can't take on this God. We're going to lose. So we better give in now. So they gave in, and they went to make this deal. The only thing is, unlike Rahab, who had heard the story of God, and she was genuine, they were full of deceit. They went around and they were full of deception. So they were not like Rahab at all in that sense. We've already noted how victory and success can leave us vulnerable to pride and self-sufficiency. Joshua is a successful soldier. We know that because from the days of Moses, we know he's a successful soldier. He knows how to plan. He knows how to strategize. He knows how to size up the enemy. It's interesting, isn't it? I have this motto, which many of you would have heard me say. Well, I think you would have heard me say, because I think I say it often. And it's this: at some point, your strength is going to become your weakness. In fact, I know I've said it in this very pulpit. And I know I've said to you as a church, at some point, whatever you see in me as your pastor as a strength in my ministry is going to become my weakness. The issue is, how do we journey with that? At some point, these strengths becomes weaknesses. So Joshua's strength was, he's a fighting man. He can work these things out. He had already done the damage for Jericho, beg your pardon, done the damage for Ai. He looked at these middle people, and they worked out that they could take him on. He had reasoned, and he had come to a conclusion about the Gibeonites, but it was a wrong conclusion. This is where you have a PowerPoint, Yukton, in case you are worried. They were relying on their own understanding. So I'll put up Proverbs 3 for you. Because the word of God tells us we are not to depend on our own understanding. You see, your own understanding which says we can take these, we can do this without consulting the Lord because we have all that we need. I think I want to ask the question and give you 30 seconds to ask you, not to speak out loud, but in your mind, younger and older people alike, what are some of your bad habits? Because actually, even in teenage years, you can have bad habits by then. What are your bad habits? And I'm not asking you to tell me, just to think about it. What are your bad habits? And then ask yourself, what do you think are the triggers for that erupting? Just for 30 seconds. What are your bad habits? What do you think? It's interesting. There was a time when When I was growing up as a younger lad, preachers used to preach regularly about habitual sin, the thing that will not go away, that happens every so often. And you know you've prayed about it. You know that you believe you're a conqueror in Jesus and you're victorious in Jesus. And yet 6 months later, you do it again and you think, oh no, Lord, I thought I had resolved that one. It used to be called habitual sin. I don't hear people referring to that anymore, so it's out of fashion, I think. But it's a habit. Okay, back to the story. What's the time? Yes, back to the story. I think this story reminds me that we need to always be on the lookout for wolf in sheep's clothing. In other words, people pretending to be what they're not. I think we need to be careful about that. You see it in friendships. You see it in relationships, love relationships. A boyfriend, a girlfriend who might become all things Christian, or at least make all the right noises until you establish that relationship. And then you realize that what they've said is not who they really are, but really it was all about love. They just knew the right words. You know, when you look at this story, the Gibeonites knew all the right words. They could speak all the right words. They knew how to talk about God. They knew about the battles. Although, if you notice, it's interesting, they only talked about the battle that happened a long time ago, and they didn't talk about Ai, and they didn't talk about Jericho, because they knew if they had mentioned those two, Joshua would have found them out, because he would have said, aha, the only way you could know that is if you're living nearby, because the news would never have got all the way there. So they were very selective in what they were saying. They told enough truth to seduce and to, like a fishing hook, to spit it out and to reel Joshua in. There was enough there for them. They were not ambassadors from a far-off land. They were tricksters who lived nearby. They knew about Joshua's victory, and they were probably scheming for their lives. Now, here's the thing. Deuteronomy 7:2, next slide, please, because I'm all over the place at the moment. You probably noticed. Just what I will declare to you. Deuteronomy 7:2 and other verses in the Bible tells us that this entry into this occupation into the promised land, Canaan, was meant to be absolute, because the idea is there was meant to be no alliances, no relationships with the inhabitants of these lands, the neighbors of these lands, because God was concerned about idolatry. God was concerned that if they enter into relationships with these other people who are not believers, people who God had given a long time to get their act together, who would not repent, who would not see the way of the Lord, and that's why they were being, if you want, ethnically cleansed. Not very popular language to use, but that's what was going on. Despite God was saying, I don't want you to have relationships with them, because you're going to end up following them. You're going to end up following their values. You're going to end up taking your eyes off me and worshiping other gods. So the idea was, do not form any alliances with these people. But nonetheless, the point is, in the story this morning, Joshua did just that. He got it wrong. They made a mistake. I want to say something about the devil here, because I think when I read this, everything about the story is negative, because it has connotations of deception and work of the enemy. The enemy is Satan, and the enemy is Beelzebub, the devil. His way is deceptive, and his way is scheming, it's sly, it's sneaky, and he will do anything to cause the Christian to compromise or to disobey. I was looking at this and thinking, you can see how I was thinking, a little pussycat when reflected looks like a big lion. I was thinking about the enemy who walks around like a roaring lion, 1 Peter, that's where my mind was going, 1 Peter 5, right, with this picture. Chapter 9. Interestingly, begins with 5 nations. I love the juxtaposition of this. 5 nations okay, decided that they're going to form a coalition and they're going to come against Joshua and the Israelites because they've heard what God has done and they think, you know something, on our own, we can't do it. Guys, I know we normally have tribal battles. Let's stop that. Let's come together, the 5 of us. Let's make a pact because 5 of us together, we can take on Joshua and his God. The Gibeonites, they decided, so their intention was war. The Gibeonites, they wanted to walk the road of peace. Isn't that interesting? They wanted to walk the road of peace. Now, it's easy if somebody says, I want to fight you, to take them on. But when somebody comes to you and say all the nice things and all the right things, and there's enough truth in it, and they're all peaceful, with a winsome, loving personality, you're more endearing to them, aren't you? And you embrace them, don't you? But that's what was happening in this story. That's what was happening in this story. They talked well of God. They knew of the battles. They were very plausible. They were very believable. They seemed to be nice people, to be honest, except that they were seducing Joshua to disobey God and to offer them refuge. Because once they were offered refuge, because of the nature of the oath that they were making to God, it was impossible for Joshua and the Israelites to break that oath, because to do that would be to be speaking against the name of God, who promised to take them in and provide for them and care for them. And now this God has gone back on his word. It would have damaged God's reputation. Friends, be careful of the oath that you make. Don't break them easily because they say something about your God and your relationship with your God. And so they couldn't do that, and they wouldn't do that. 2 wrongs don't make a right anyhow. So Joshua enters into this relationship, and 3 days later they discover, whoa, they're neighbors. They only live maximum 20, 25 miles away. They're neighbors. They tricked us. Be careful about sampling the produce of those who come looking as if they're bearing all these lovely gifts, because actually it isn't as lovely as it looks. It isn't all that it seems. The New Testament spiritual lesson we learn from this story is that the enemy schemes. So Christians need to put on, Ephesians 6, the full armor of God. The full armor of God, that they may stand. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Be careful, friends, of the little compromises that we make. Be careful, because, you know, the devil, do you remember when the devil was tempting Jesus, what did he quote? He quoted scripture. Be careful of these things. In fact, 2 Corinthians 11 tells us, the Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, tells us that actually the devil can appear as an angel of light. Makes everything look really nice and good and perfect, just right. So you see how important it is for us as Christians to be always discerning, always consult the Lord on everything, consult the Lord. Be discerning, lean not on your own understanding, but consult the Lord in all these things. I want to say one last thing very quickly before we finish. And it's this. This story, in all its negativity, has a wonderful aspect of grace, and I'm glad that Maggie chose the Stormzy song, etc., and why she chose the hymn, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, etc., because it has a wonderful story of God's grace. Even though Joshua did wrong by making peace with the neighbors, God chose to use it for good. God in his grace, he chose to use it for good. And the interesting thing is, here's the interesting thing. So when you read chapter 10, and those of you get time later in the week, find time and read it if you're interested. Joshua would have had to take on these nations one at a time. So 5 of them come together, So he would take on 5 at one time. And he ended up defeating 5. So it actually hastened the occupation of the land. Interestingly, what happened is the other 5 in chapter 10 heard what the Gibeonites did. And they said, you know something? Let's go and attack the Gibeonites because they're traitors. So they went to attack the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites sent a message to Joshua, the Israelites, saying, hey, you need to help us. Remember, you promised you made a peace treaty with us? So Joshua and his men went in order to protect the Gibeonites, and they did in all 5 of the others. So you see, the occupation happened even quicker. God in his grace hastened the occupation. But there's more grace in this story. There's more grace, and it's this. The Gibeonites they said, we're here to serve. They were allowed to serve. They were taken as those to serve. But it's where they served. There were these woodcutters and what have you serving at the altar, at the very heart of Israel's worship. God allowed them, despite this horrible mistake, to serve at the very heart of his worship. So you can see what's going to happen over time. Instead of the Israelites following the Gibeonites, they're going to learn more about the Israelites' God. Are you with me? And they're going to end up worshiping this God. In fact, when you read the book of Ezra, you would see that the Gibeonites are mentioned there. And from my studies, I've discovered that at no point do we read that Israel had any trouble with the Gibeonites. They remained serving Israel's God. Interesting that, isn't it? And it all came out of a mistake. It all came out of a mistake. Now, you and I, when we make a mistake, we think it's the end of the world. We think we're done for. And I see God's grace in this. God, who is a God of first and second and third chances. God who says, I know you think you've done awful, and indeed you have, but my grace is sufficient for your needs. And this is the God who comes and he meets us in these mistakes. And in and through Jesus, as we repent, as we seek forgiveness, as we turn around and all such things, we are given a chance to be afresh and to experience God's grace. A last slide to finish. The Apostle Paul, Philippians 4, says, do not worry. I like a version which says, don't be pulled in different directions or worried. But this says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Friends, please, will you notice the word everything? Always consult the Lord. Pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank him for all he has done. If you do this, you will experience God's peace, which is far more wonderful than the human mind can understand. His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus. Pray about everything. Consult the Lord. Again, going back to this well-being thing, we live in an age of mindfulness. Develop a mindfulness of the presence of God. We were singing earlier on, let us rejoice in his presence. Develop a mindset of the presence of God. Willfully and deliberately bring yourself into a mindfulness of knowing that God is with you. Pray about things. Talk to the Lord about things. This is what prayer without ceasing is all about, I guess. Just be engaging with the Lord. Just talking to him about everything, all things, anytime. And if you, in the middle of the day, whether you're at school or whether you're at work or whether you're doing the gardening, well, nobody does the gardening in this weather, I guess, anymore, or whatever you're doing, or driving along, and the Spirit reminds you, bring yourself back into a mindfulness of the presence of God. Bring yourself back into a sense. I do that every so often. It's so hard to sustain. I really struggle at sustaining it. And then it goes, and then I bring it back, and then it goes again. But it's something I keep working at. And I don't know if you work at it, but I want to encourage you to work at it. That you would always consult the Lord. That we won't lean on our understanding. That no matter how plausible, how believable things may appear, we wouldn't fall for it. Because it could be deceptive. It could be the enemy seducing us, pulling us away from God and the things of God. It could be, not necessarily, but it could be. Be a people of discernment. Be a people of discernment.